Ben Carter had exactly $47 in his wallet that December morning, and 2 breakfast sandwiches growing cold on the diner table between him and his 8-year-old son. His hands still ached from the night shift, his stomach hollow and demanding, but none of that mattered the moment the elderly woman pushed through the glass door. She moved as if winter had settled deep into her bones, slow, trembling, her eyes scanning the room with the desperate hunger of someone who'd forgotten what a warm meal felt like. The diner fell silent, that particular kind of silence that happens when people choose not to see. But Ben saw her. He saw the way her fingers clutched at nothing, the way she stood at the threshold as if waiting for permission to exist. And in that moment, with his son watching and his own belly empty, he had to choose between the sandwich in front of him and the man he wanted to be. He didn't know that this choice, made in the space between one breath and the next, would break his life open in ways he couldn't imagine. He simply thought that his life already held so much hardship, one more empty breakfast wouldn't change anything. But perhaps he was wrong. Ben Carter's hands ached as he pushed open the glass door of Dave's diner, the warmth inside hitting his face like a blessing after the bitter December wind outside. The smell of coffee and bacon grease filled his lungs, familiar and comforting in a way that made his empty stomach clench with both anticipation and shame. He'd been up since 4 that morning, finishing an overnight shift at the construction site downtown. And his body was running on fumes and the promise of that Saturday breakfast he and Tyler shared every week, without fail. It was their ritual, their one small luxury in a life that had become nothing but work and worry and the constant mental arithmetic of bills he couldn't quite pay. The diner was already half full with the usual crowd, truck drivers nursing coffee, a few elderly regulars reading newspapers, a young couple in the corner booth lost in their own world. Dave stood behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he spotted Ben. Tyler bounced ahead, his worn sneakers squeaking against the checkered linoleum floor, and slid into their usual booth by the window. At 8 years old, he still had that energy that seemed impossible to Ben, who felt at least twice his actual 38 years most mornings. The boy's jacket was too thin for the weather, one size too small, because he'd grown 3 inches since last winter, but he wore it with the kind of oblivious joy that only children possessed. Ben felt the familiar weight settle in his chest as he watched his son press his hands against the cold window glass, watching the early morning traffic roll by on Main Street. He should be able to buy his kid a proper winter coat. He should be able to do a lot of things. Instead, he had $47 to last until Friday, a broken heater in their apartment, and the knowledge that he was one unexpected expense away from disaster at any given moment. 2 breakfast specials, Dave, Ben called out as he slid into the booth across from Tyler, his back protesting the movement. The vinyl seat was patched with duct tape in 3 places, comfortable in its familiarity. Dave waved an acknowledgement, already reaching for the griddle. They'd been coming here for 3 years, ever since Ben's wife left, and he'd found himself alone with a 5-year-old, and no idea how to be both mother and father at once. Dave never asked questions, never looked at him with pity, and always made sure Tyler got an extra slice of toast without charging for it. These small kindnesses kept Ben going more than the man probably knew. Tyler was telling him something about school, about a project on the solar system, his words tumbling out faster than Ben could quite follow in his exhausted state. Ben nodded and made appropriate sounds, trying to focus, trying to be present for his son, even though his mind kept drifting to the pile of bills on their kitchen table. The rent was due in 5 days. His truck needed new tires before it failed inspection. Tyler needed new shoes before his current ones fell apart completely. The math never worked out, no matter how many times Ben ran the numbers, no matter how many extra shifts he picked up. He was treading water in the middle of an ocean, and every day the shore seemed a little farther away. The breakfast sandwiches arrived in their plastic baskets, steam rising from the toasted bread, eggs and cheese and bacon stacked between them like small miracles. Ben's stomach clenched at the sight, saliva flooding his mouth. He hadn't eaten since noon yesterday, saving money wherever he could, skipping meals so Tyler never had to. The boy dug in immediately, telling a story between bites about his friend Alex and something that happened at recess. Ben picked up his own sandwich, the warmth of it seeping into his cold fingers, and was about to take that first glorious bite when the door chimed again. The elderly woman who entered looked like she'd been carved from winter itself. Her clothes hung on a frame that had once been larger, layers of threadbare coats and sweaters doing little to hide the way she shook from cold or hunger or both. Her face was weathered, deeply lined, but her eyes were what stopped Ben cold. Pale blue and desperately scanning the room with a hunger that went beyond physical need. She moved slowly, painfully, one hand gripping the doorframe as if the effort of standing required all her strength. The diner's warmth seemed to hit her like a wave, and for a moment she just stood there, swaying slightly, breathing in the smell of food and coffee and temporary safety. Ben watched as several customers noticed her and immediately looked away, their conversations continuing without pause. A man in a business suit actually shifted in his seat to put his back to her more fully. The young couple glanced up, whispered something to each other, and returned to their phones. Dave, busy at the griddle, hadn't seen her yet. The woman took one careful step inside, then another, her eyes fixed on the counter like a drowning person looking at a distant shore. She moved toward the trash can near the door, where someone had left half a muffin on top, and Ben understood with sudden, horrible clarity what she was about to do. Tyler had stopped talking, his sandwich halfway to his mouth, watching the woman with the uncomplicated concern of childhood. "Dad," he whispered, and there was a question in that single word that Ben felt in his bones. He looked down at his own sandwich, still warm in his hands, then at his son's face, then back at the woman who was now reaching for the discarded muffin with shaking fingers. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten, that he'd earned this meal through back-breaking work, that he had his own child to feed. But Tyler was still watching him, and Ben realized with crystal clarity that what he did in the next 30 seconds would teach his son more about being a man than any words ever could. He set down his sandwich and slid out of the booth before he could overthink it. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, and the woman flinched, her hand pulling back from the trash can as if she'd been caught stealing. Up close, she looked even more fragile, her skin papery and pale, her breath coming in short gasps. "Ma'am, would you like to sit down? I have an extra sandwich here." The lie came easily, automatically, and he gestured back to their booth where Tyler sat, watching with wide eyes. The woman's pale blue eyes fixed on his face, searching for mockery or cruelty, finding only tiredness and something that might have been kindness. "I couldn't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, cultured and careful despite the trembling. "I don't want to impose." But her eyes betrayed her, flickering to the basket on the table with naked longing. Ben could see her trying to maintain dignity, trying to hold on to whatever pride she had left, and it broke something in him. He knew that feeling, that constant balance between need and self-respect, between asking for help and maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. "You wouldn't be imposing," Ben said gently. "I already ordered it, and I'm not as hungry as I thought." "Please." He held out his hand, not quite touching her, but offering support if she needed it. For a long moment, she just stood there, and Ben could see the war happening behind her eyes. Need versus dignity, hunger versus pride. Then, slowly, she nodded and allowed him to guide her to the booth. She sank into the seat beside Tyler, with a sound that was half relief and half pain, her hands shaking as she placed them flat on the table, as if to steady herself. Ben picked up his sandwich and placed it in front of her, the basket and all, ignoring the way his stomach twisted with hunger. "Please," he said again. "Take your time." Tyler watched this exchange with solemn attention, and when the woman's eyes filled with tears, he pushed his extra napkins across the table to her, without a word. She stared at the sandwich for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real, then picked it up with both hands and took a small, careful bite. The sound she made, a soft exhalation of relief, was almost painful to hear. Ben slid back into his seat and wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, not trusting himself to speak, watching as this stranger ate his breakfast with the kind of hunger that spoke of days, maybe weeks, without proper food. They sat in silence, the three of them, while the morning traffic outside grew heavier and Dave started taking orders for the lunch rush. The woman ate slowly, methodically, making the sandwich last. And when she was done, she carefully folded the napkin and placed it beside the empty basket. "Thank you," she said, looking at Ben with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You didn't have to do that." Her voice was stronger now, fed and warm, and Ben could hear the remnants of education in her careful diction, traces of a life that had once been different. "It's okay," Ben said, meaning it, even though his stomach was cramping with hunger. "We've all needed help sometimes." Tyler nodded seriously, and the woman's eyes moved to the boy, lingering on his too small jacket and worn shoes, understanding passing across her face. She reached across the table and squeezed Ben's hand once, briefly, her grip surprisingly strong. "You're a good man," she said quietly. "Your son is lucky to have you." Then she stood carefully, steadying herself against the table, and made her way toward the door. Ben watched her go, wondering about her story, about how someone who spoke like she did ended up desperate and alone. He'd never know, probably. She'd just be another face in the endless parade of people struggling to survive in a world that seemed designed to grind you down. Tyler waited until the door closed behind her before speaking. "You gave her your breakfast." It wasn't a question, just an observation, but there was something in his voice that made Ben look at him carefully. The boy wasn't upset, wasn't accusing him of anything. If anything, he looked proud. And that pride was worth more than any breakfast sandwich. "Yeah, buddy," Ben said, ruffling his son's hair. "I did." Tyler thought about this for a moment, then pushed his own basket toward the middle of the table. "We can share mine," he said matter-of-factly. "Half each." And just like that, Ben's heart felt too large for his chest. They split Tyler's sandwich down the middle, not quite enough for either of them, but enough to take the edge off the hunger. And Ben thought that maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right with this whole single father thing after all. The rest of the day passed in the usual blur of exhaustion and responsibility. Ben drove Tyler to his friend's house for a birthday party, spent 2 hours fixing their landlord's garage door for a $100 rent reduction, then collapsed on their worn couch while Tyler did homework at the kitchen table. By the time they ate dinner, spaghetti with butter, because that was what they had, he'd almost forgotten about the woman from the diner. Almost, but not quite. There was something about her eyes that stayed with him, the way she'd looked at the sandwich like it was a miracle, the careful dignity with which she'd eaten it. He wondered if she'd found somewhere warm to sleep that night, if she'd eaten again, if anyone else would show her the basic kindness he'd stumbled into giving. But mostly, he was just grateful that Tyler had seen him make the right choice, even if it cost them. That week unfolded like all the others, relentless, unforgiving, a constant battle against time and money and the limitations of a single body stretched too thin. Ben worked his regular shifts at the construction site, came home to make dinner and help with homework, tucked Tyler into bed with a story he was usually too tired to remember clearly. The $47 dwindled to $23, then $12, then $6, and some change that had to last until Friday's paycheck. He skipped lunch 3 days running, told Tyler he'd eaten at work, and felt the familiar gnaw of hunger become background noise to his existence. This was his life now, had been for 3 years, and he'd accepted it with the grim determination of someone who had no other choice. Wednesday brought disaster in the form of a grinding noise from his truck's transmission as he drove home from the site. Ben pulled into their apartment parking lot and sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calculate costs he knew he couldn't afford. The truck was 20 years old, held together by determination and duct tape, but it was his lifeline to work, to Tyler's school, to everything. Without it, they were sunk. He called Frank from the site, who knew his way around engines, and got the news he'd been dreading. "Transmission's going," Frank said after 10 minutes under the hood. "Could be $200 to fix, could be $2,000. Won't know until we get it to a shop." Ben thanked him and went inside, where Tyler was doing math homework at the kitchen table, and wondered how he was going to explain that they might not have a car anymore. Thursday, he borrowed a ride from another co-worker to get to the site, dropping Tyler off at school on the way, and spent the entire day calculating and recalculating numbers that refused to work out. His bank account had $83. His Friday paycheck would be around $400 after taxes. Rent was due Monday, $750 for their tiny 2-bedroom apartment. The truck repair would start at $200 minimum. They needed groceries. Tyler's shoes were literally splitting at the seams. There was no room for error, no margin for disaster, no breathing space whatsoever. Ben worked through lunch again, his stomach a hollow ache, and tried to figure out which bill he could skip paying without catastrophic consequences. The answer, as always, was none of them. Friday morning, he woke to find Tyler at the kitchen table, his piggy bank open in front of him, carefully counting change. "I have $12.37, the boy announced seriously. "For the truck." Ben felt something crack in his chest. Looking at his 8-year-old son trying to solve adult problems with birthday money and tooth fairy quarters. "Buddy, no," he said, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "That's your money." But Tyler shook his head stubbornly, that determination he'd inherited from his father, showing clearly. "We need it more," he said simply, and Ben had to turn away because his eyes were burning and he didn't want his son to see him cry. He accepted the money with gratitude he couldn't quite voice, knowing it wouldn't be enough, but loving Tyler fiercely for offering it anyway. He got his paycheck that afternoon, cashed it immediately, and stared at the bills in his hand like they held the answer to impossible questions. $412, plus Tyler's $12.37, plus the $83 still in his account. That gave him just over $500 total. The truck would cost at minimum $200. Rent was $750. Groceries, maybe $60 if he was careful. Electricity bill, $90. That left him $200 short on rent, with no prospect of making it up before Monday. He could talk to the landlord, maybe, ask for an extension. But he'd already done that twice this year, and the man's patience was wearing thin. Ben sat in his truck in the bank parking lot and let himself feel the full weight of defeat for exactly 5 minutes. Then he started the engine, heard the terrible grinding noise, and drove carefully toward the mechanic's shop to get the damage assessed. The weekend brought cold rain and colder news. The mechanic looked at his truck and quoted him $450 for a rebuilt transmission. "And that's the cheap option," the man said, not unkindly. "A new one would run you $1,500. Ben thanked him and walked home through the rain, 2 miles because he didn't want to waste gas money, and arrived soaked and shivering to find Tyler watching cartoons with their neighbor's daughter. Mrs. Walsh from across the hall had clearly been babysitting, and she waved away his thanks with practiced ease. She was retired, widowed, spent most of her time gardening in the small plot behind the building, and had taken a grandmotherly interest in Tyler from the moment they'd moved in. "He's a good boy," she said, as she always did. "No trouble at all." After she left, Ben sat down next to Tyler on the couch and tried to figure out how to explain that they might have to move, that the truck couldn't be fixed, that everything was falling apart and he couldn't stop it. But Tyler spoke first, his eyes still on the television. "It's okay if we have to take the bus, Dad," he said quietly. "Alex takes the bus. It's not that bad." And Ben realized his son had known all along, had probably been worrying about this all week, trying to be brave for his father's sake. He pulled the boy close, hugged him tight, and promised himself that somehow, some way, he'd figure this out. He always did. He had to. There was no other option when you were the only thing standing between your child and disaster. Monday morning arrived with brutal clarity. Ben counted out $700 for rent, knowing it wasn't enough, but hoping the landlord would accept it as a down payment. He pocketed the remaining $212, gas, food, electricity, truck payment, all the impossible needs, and walked Tyler to school because the truck was still sitting in the mechanic's lot like an expensive monument to his failure. The walk took 45 minutes. Tyler complained once, then saw the look on his father's face and went quiet. By the time Ben got to the construction site, he was 15 minutes late, and his supervisor was waiting with crossed arms and a lecture about punctuality that Ben absorbed silently, knowing he couldn't afford to lose this job, knowing also that he couldn't afford to fix the truck that would let him be on time. That afternoon, he walked back to pick up Tyler, another 45 minutes through cold that seemed to seep into his bones and settle there. His feet ached, his back throbbed, his hands were raw from the day's work. Tyler met him at the school gates with his usual bright smile, but Ben could see the worry underneath, the way his son glanced at the parking lot looking for their truck and found only empty spaces. They stopped at the small grocery store on the way home, and Ben bought pasta, tomato sauce, eggs, bread, the cheapest things he could find that would last, and watched the total climb to $53 with the sick feeling of watching your last lifeline fray. They were 2 blocks from home when Tyler stopped walking. Ben turned, saw his son standing still on the sidewalk, looking at his shoes, where the sole had finally separated completely from the body of the sneaker. The boy's face crumpled for just a second before he got it under control, and Ben felt something break inside him. "It's okay," Tyler said quickly, seeing his father's expression. "I can tape them." But it wasn't okay. None of this was okay. Ben knelt down on the cold sidewalk, pulled tape from their grocery bag, because of course he'd bought tape. He always had tape for the endless small repairs their life required, and bound his son's shoe back together. It would last maybe a week, maybe less. He didn't know what they'd do after that. That night, after Tyler was asleep, Ben sat at the kitchen table with all their bills spread out in front of him and tried to perform miracles with arithmetic. The numbers refused to cooperate. No matter how he added, subtracted, prioritized, or postponed, he was drowning. The landlord had accepted the $700 with a warning that the remaining $50 was due by Friday, or they'd start eviction proceedings. The electricity company had sent a disconnect notice. The truck would cost $450 they didn't have. Tyler needed shoes. They needed groceries. Ben needed to keep working, which meant he needed transportation. The circle was unbreakable, the problem unsolvable. He put his head in his hands and allowed himself one moment of complete despair before straightening up, gathering the bills, and going to bed. Somehow, he'd figure it out. He always did, even when he had no ideas how. The week crawled by in a blur of walking and working and watching his son pretend everything was fine. Ben picked up every extra hour he could at the site, working through lunch breaks, staying late, doing anything to add a few more dollars to the paycheck that would come Friday. His body ached constantly now, the physical exhaustion compounding with the mental stress until he felt like he was moving through water. Tyler learned to walk to and from school with friends, lying cheerfully to their parents about why his dad couldn't drive anymore. Mrs. Walsh continued to check on them, bringing over casseroles that Ben accepted with gratitude that shamed him. He was failing, he knew. Failing to provide, failing to protect, failing at the one job that mattered, keeping his son safe and secure. Thursday afternoon, as he was leaving the site, Frank pulled him aside. "Heard about your truck," he said without preamble. "Listen, my cousin has a shop. He owes me a favor." I called him. "He'll do your transmission for $250, parts and labor. Payment plan, okay." Ben stared at him, trying to process this unexpected kindness. This lifeline thrown when he'd stopped expecting rescue. "Frank, I can't," he started, but Frank waved him off. "You helped me move last year. Spent your whole Sunday carrying furniture. You never asked for anything. Let me help now." And just like that, one impossible problem became merely difficult. Ben's eyes burned as he thanked Frank, gripped his hand, and wondered what he'd done to deserve friends like this. That night, he sat Tyler down and explained that they were going to be okay, that the truck would be fixed, that sometimes good people helped when you needed it most. Tyler listened seriously, then said, "Like you helped that lady at the diner." Ben had almost forgotten about the elderly woman, that Saturday morning that felt like a lifetime ago. "Yeah," he said, surprised by the connection. "Like that." Tyler nodded as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking about, and went back to his homework. But Ben sat there for a long time afterward, thinking about kindness and how it moved through the world in unexpected ways, how Frank's help felt like an echo of his own small action weeks before. Maybe that's how people survived, he thought, by helping each other in small ways, creating chains of kindness that kept everyone from drowning. Friday brought his paycheck and a surprise. The truck, fixed by Frank's cousin, was delivered back to their parking lot with a note saying payment could wait until next month. The electricity company accepted a payment plan. The landlord, seeing Ben's genuine effort, agreed to extend the remaining balance another week. Tyler's teacher called to say the school had some extra shoes from a donation drive if Ben was interested. Each small mercy felt like a miracle, like the universe had decided to stop grinding him down for just a moment and give him room to breathe. By Saturday morning, when Ben woke up and realized he could actually take Tyler to their regular breakfast at the diner, he felt something close to hope for the first time in weeks. They slid into their usual booth, and Dave brought them their regular order without being asked. Tyler chattered about school, about his friend's new video game, about the science project he was planning, and Ben let the normalcy of it wash over him. This was what he'd been fighting for. These ordinary moments, this simple ritual. The chance to give his son a childhood that felt secure even when everything underneath was chaos. He bit into his sandwich. He'd earned this one. No one was taking it. And watched Tyler do the same, and felt the weight of the past 3 weeks begin to lift just slightly. They were finishing up when Ben saw Dave talking to a man in an expensive suit near the door. The man looked out of place in the diner, his clothes too fine, his briefcase too polished. He was showing Dave something, a photograph maybe, and Dave was shaking his head, then looking around the diner. His eyes landed on Ben and stopped. He pointed. The man in the suit turned, studied Ben for a long moment, then nodded and started walking toward their booth. Ben's first instinct was fear. Had he done something wrong? Was this about unpaid bills? Was someone suing him? But the man's face was neutral, professional, not threatening. "Excuse me," the man said, stopping beside their table. "Are you Ben Carter?" His voice was educated, careful, the kind that came from years of dealing with important matters in quiet rooms. Ben nodded slowly, his mind racing through possibilities, coming up blank. "Yes. Can I help you?" The man glanced at Tyler, then back at Ben. "My name is Robert Harrison. I'm an attorney. I wonder if I could speak with you privately for a moment." Now Ben's heart was hammering. Lawyers meant trouble. Lawyers meant things he couldn't afford. But he looked at Tyler, gestured for him to stay put, and slid out of the booth to follow Harrison a few steps away. Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large envelope. "Mr. Carter, this is going to sound unusual, but I need to ask you something. Do you remember, about 4 weeks ago, you were here on a Saturday morning with your son?" Ben frowned, confused. "I'm here every Saturday morning with my son." Harrison nodded. "Do you remember giving your breakfast to an elderly woman who came into the diner?" And suddenly, Ben understood, or thought he did. "Is she okay? Did something happen to her?" Concern flooded through him, genuine worry for that fragile stranger. Harrison's expression softened slightly. "That woman was Margaret Sullivan. She passed away 2 weeks ago. She was 73 years old." Ben felt the news like a physical blow. He'd only met her once, briefly, but the thought of her dead, of that desperate hunger being her final weeks, made him feel sick. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wish I could have done more." Harrison was looking at him strangely now, something like surprise or approval in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, do you know who Margaret Sullivan was?" Ben shook his head. Harrison opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph. The woman from the diner, but different. Healthy. Smiling. Wearing expensive clothes in what looked like a corporate office. She was the founder and former CEO of Sullivan Property Group. She owned 17 commercial buildings in this city alone. Her estate is worth approximately $8 million. Ben stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the desperate woman he'd seen with this confident businesswoman. "I don't understand." Harrison put the photo away carefully. "Mrs. Sullivan spent the last 3 months of her life doing something she called the final test. She would disguise herself and visit public places to see how people treated those they perceived as less fortunate. She went to restaurants, parks, churches, malls. She approached over 200 people during that time." He paused, making sure Ben was following. "You were the only person who offered her food. The only one." The diner seemed to tilt around Ben. He reached out to steady himself against the booth, his mind refusing to process what he was hearing. "That can't be right. Someone else must have—" But Harrison was shaking his head. "No one else. She documented everything. She has 3 months of video and written records. People ignored her, insulted her, told her to leave, called security on her. You gave her your breakfast when you clearly needed it yourself. You treated her with kindness and dignity. She never forgot that." Ben's legs felt weak. Tyler was watching from the booth, concern on his young face. "Why are you telling me this?" Harrison handed him the envelope. "Because Mrs. Sullivan's will contains specific instructions. She wanted me to find the man who gave me his sandwich when his own child was hungry." Those were her exact words. "It took us 2 weeks to track you down. Dave remembered your name but didn't have contact information. We had to cross-reference with local construction companies." He gestured to the envelope. "This contains a cashier's check for $50,000. It also contains information about a college fund she established for Tyler. Full tuition, room, and board. Books. All expenses covered through graduation from any accredited university. And there's a letter." Ben's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The check was real. $50,000, made out to Benjamin Carter, signed by Harrison's law firm as executors of the estate. The college fund paperwork was equally real, legally binding, Tyler's name in bold letters at the top. But it was the letter, in shaky handwriting, that must have cost Margaret Sullivan tremendous effort near the end of her life, that broke him. He read it standing there in the middle of Dave's diner, tears streaming down his face without shame, while Tyler watched and Harrison waited patiently. "Dear Ben," it read, "I don't know if they'll find you. I hope they do. I want you to know that in 3 months of looking for kindness, I found only indifference and contempt. People crossed the street to avoid me. They wouldn't meet my eyes. They treated me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was something dirty to be removed. I was the same person I'd always been, intelligent, capable, worthy of basic human dignity. But because I looked poor and desperate, I became nothing to them. You saw me. You gave me your breakfast when you were clearly struggling yourself. You did it without hesitation, without making me feel ashamed, without asking anything in return. Your son watched you make that choice, and I saw the way he looked at you afterward, with pride and love and the kind of respect that can't be faked. You're teaching him how to be a good man. That matters more than you know. The letter continued. I made my fortune in real estate, in buying and selling buildings, in understanding market value and investment potential. But that Saturday morning, I learned what real wealth looks like. It looks like a man with $47 giving away his breakfast. It looks like a father teaching his son that people matter more than hunger. It looks like kindness offered when it costs you something to give it. I'm dying now, Ben. Cancer. Quick and efficient. I don't have much time left. But I wanted to make sure that, at least once before I go, I repay kindness with kindness. This money isn't charity, it's acknowledgement. You restored my faith in humanity in my final months. You gave me hope that people like you exist in the world. I'm giving you this because you earned it. Not through work or cleverness, but through being exactly who you are. Use it well. Teach Tyler to pass it on. And know that somewhere, a lonely old woman is grateful she met you. With respect and admiration, Margaret Sullivan. Ben stood there with the letter in his shaking hands, and suddenly everything from the past 4 weeks made sense. The impossible coincidence of help appearing exactly when he needed it. Frank's cousin, the payment plans, the teacher's donation, Mrs. Walsh's casseroles. He'd offered one small kindness, and the universe had somehow returned it 100-fold. He looked at Harrison through his tears. I don't know what to say. Harrison smiled, the first genuine warmth breaking through his professional demeanor. She hoped you'd say yes. There's one more thing. He pulled out a business card. Mrs. Sullivan's nephew runs Sullivan Property Group now. He's looking for a construction supervisor for their building maintenance division. Better pay. Benefits. Regular hours. The job is yours if you want it. Ben's vision was blurring, the diner swimming around him. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. He'd given away a sandwich, that was all. One small action that had cost him nothing but temporary hunger. How could that deserve this? But Harrison was pressing the envelope into his hands, solid and real, and Tyler was calling Dad from the booth, worried now. And Ben realized that, yes, this was happening. Margaret Sullivan, a woman he'd met for 15 minutes weeks ago, had changed his entire life because he'd been kind when it cost him something to be kind. She'd seen him when he felt invisible, and she'd made sure he'd never have to choose between his hunger and his humanity again. He walked back to the booth on legs that barely supported him, slid in beside Tyler, and showed his son the letter and the check and the college fund paperwork. Tyler read slowly, sounding out the big words, and when he looked up, his eyes were wide with confusion and hope. Does this mean we're okay, Dad? And Ben, who'd been holding everything together through sheer will for 3 years, who'd walked 45 minutes each way to work, who'd taped his son's shoes together and skipped meals and calculated every penny, finally let himself believe it. Yeah, buddy, he said, his voice breaking. We're okay. We're gonna be okay. The following weeks passed in a kind of daze. Ben deposited the check, paid off every bill in full, bought Tyler 3 pairs of new shoes and a winter coat that actually fit. He accepted the job offer from Sullivan Property Group, gave notice at the construction site, and started work in an office with regular hours and health insurance and paid vacation. The money in his account stopped being a source of constant anxiety and became something strange and unfamiliar, a cushion, a buffer, a source of security he'd almost forgotten could exist. He paid Frank back for the truck repair, insisted despite Frank's protests. He bought Mrs. Walsh flowers and a gift certificate to her favorite garden center. He donated to Tyler's school, anonymously, to help other kids whose parents were struggling like he had been. But the real change was quieter, more internal. Ben found himself noticing people he'd always overlooked before: the homeless man near the subway entrance, the tired cashier at the grocery store, the janitor cleaning offices after hours. He'd always seen them, always been kind, but now he really looked, really understood how close he'd been to being invisible himself. He started carrying gift cards to restaurants in his wallet, handing them out to people who looked like they needed a meal. He volunteered at the shelter downtown, serving breakfast on Saturday mornings, after he and Tyler had their own ritual at Dave's diner. He taught Tyler that wealth wasn't about money in the bank, but about what you did with whatever you had. 6 months after that morning when Harrison walked into the diner, Ben and Tyler arrived for their regular Saturday breakfast to find a small plaque mounted on the wall beside their usual booth. Dave had put it there, he explained, commissioned it himself. It read, "In memory of Margaret Sullivan, who taught us that kindness matters most when it costs us something to give it." Below that was a simple rule: every Saturday, 1 free meal for anyone who needs it, no questions asked. Dave had started a fund with his own money, and several regulars had contributed. The diner was now a place where people knew they could get help, where being hungry or desperate didn't make you invisible. Ben ran his fingers over the plaque, thinking about the woman who'd changed his life by testing whether kindness still existed in the world. He'd passed her test without knowing he was being tested, without doing anything extraordinary, just by being the person he'd been raised to be. And she'd given him not just money or security, but something far more valuable: proof that goodness got noticed, that small actions rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict, that the world was a little less cold than it sometimes seemed. Tyler leaned against his side, reading the plaque carefully, and Ben knew his son was learning the same lesson. Be kind. See people. Help when you can. The rest would follow. That morning, as they sat in their booth waiting for breakfast, a young woman came in who looked lost and frightened, her clothes suggesting she'd been sleeping rough, her eyes holding that same desperate hunger Ben remembered from Margaret Sullivan's face. She hovered near the door, clearly unsure, clearly scared. Ben caught Dave's eye, nodded toward her, and Dave smiled and walked over to welcome her, to offer her the free meal, to treat her with the dignity every person deserved. Tyler watched this, then looked at his father. "Like you did," he said quietly. "Exactly like I did," Ben confirmed. The woman sat down 3 booths away and ordered carefully, her voice shaking with relief. Ben saw her glance at the plaque, saw her read it, saw understanding dawn in her eyes that this place was safe, that someone had thought to help people like her. Their sandwiches arrived, warm and perfect, and Ben took that first bite with genuine hunger and deeper gratitude. He wasn't naive. He knew his own struggles had been real, that many people never got the miraculous help he'd received, that Margaret Sullivan's gift was extraordinary and rare. But he also knew that he'd laid the groundwork for that miracle by being kind when it would have been easier not to be, by choosing humanity over hunger, by teaching his son through actions instead of words. The money would run out eventually if he wasn't careful. The job could end. Circumstances could change. But the lesson, that kindness mattered, that people mattered, that you helped when you could even if it cost you, that lesson would last. He'd carry it forward. Tyler would carry it forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real wealth Margaret Sullivan had given him. He thought about her often, this woman he'd barely known but who'd trusted him with her legacy. He wondered what her life had been like, what had driven her to that final test, whether she'd been disappointed by humanity or just trying to confirm there was still good left in it. He hoped she'd died knowing she'd found what she was looking for, that kindness still existed, that people like him still saw people like her, that her gesture would ripple outward through Tyler's education and Ben's new stability, and the meals served at Dave's diner to people who needed them. She'd wanted to be seen, and he'd seen her. In return, she'd made sure he'd never be invisible again. Tyler finished his sandwich and wiped his hands on his napkin, looking at his father with the kind of contentment that came from a full stomach and a secure life. "Can we help with the free meals?" he asked. "Like, put money in the fund?" Ben smiled, thinking about his son's piggy bank contribution when the truck broke down, the generosity that had always been there waiting to be nurtured. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "We can do that. We should do that." They'd give back, pay forward, continue the chain that Margaret Sullivan had strengthened with her final act. It was the least they could do. It was everything they could do. As they left the diner that morning, Ben glanced back at the plaque one last time. The winter sun was streaming through the window, hitting it just right, making the letters gleam like a promise. Kindness matters most when it costs us something to give it. He'd given a sandwich when he was hungry, and the world had given him back his future. But more than that, he'd learned that the real transaction wasn't about food or money or even security. It was about seeing each other, really seeing each other, and choosing to care anyway. That was the gift Margaret Sullivan had truly given him, not $50,000 or a college fund or a better job, but the knowledge that his choice to be kind had mattered, that he'd mattered, that in a world of 200 people who looked away, he'd been the one who looked at her and saw a human being worthy of dignity and help. He took Tyler's hand and walked to their truck, fixed, reliable, no longer a source of anxiety, and drove toward home, thinking about the strange mathematics of kindness, how you could give away what you needed most and somehow end up with everything. It didn't make logical sense. The universe didn't work that way, not usually, not reliably. But sometimes, just sometimes, it did. And that possibility, that hope, that knowledge that your actions mattered even when no one was watching, that was worth more than any bank account. He'd teach Tyler that. He'd live it every day. And when his son was grown and facing his own impossible choices, maybe he'd remember his father giving away a sandwich and choose kindness too. That would be Margaret Sullivan's real legacy, Ben thought. Not the money she'd left behind, but the reminder she'd given him that goodness still existed, still mattered, still changed lives in ways both small and profound. The sandwich had been nothing. The kindness had been everything. And in the end, that made all the difference.